Hi everyone, my name is Nelson Ernst, and today we're going to go over a presentation that I put together on the topic of the investigative judgment. Now, the reason why I spent the past few weeks putting this presentation together was for my own personal edification to start with, but also because there's been a lot of questions that people have had about this teaching over the years. And more recently, we've even had some prominent people within the Seventh-day Adventist Church falling away. And one of the doctrines that they're questioning is, of course, the investigative judgment. So I thought that it would be worth my time to try to put something together on this topic, and in hopes that it would be of benefit not just to myself, but also to others who might be having questions about this. And maybe they've heard some ideas about how the investigative judgment is not biblical. So the investigative judgment, is it biblical or not? I just want to mention from the outset that this is a study that I've put together that has pulled from a variety of different resources. Of course, I've done a lot of my own looking into this topic, but I really want to just encourage everybody who's watching this to check out some of these resources right here. The Adventist Church has put together some really good resources on the topic of Daniel and Revelation. And this series of books that we're looking at right here, you can access by purchasing them online. If you just scan the QR code, it'll take you straight to them. This is a great series of books. There's so much good information in here beyond the scope of the investigative judgment. But the Adventist Church had these books put together by the Daniel and Revelation Study Committee because questions that people have had about various aspects of the church's stance on Bible prophecy and our understanding of eschatology and our views on the judgment. So this is a really good set of books. I highly encourage everybody to get this. It does make for some pretty thick reading, so you know, you definitely want to come at it with a student cap on, so to speak, ready to really dig into it slowly, digest what's in there. But this is a great exhaustive resources right here in this set of books. Now, if you want a more simplified version, Clifford Goldstein has taken those books and kind of boiled them down into a book of his own called 1844 Made Simple. I highly recommend that as well. If you just kind of want an appetizer on some of these topics, you can scan the QR code here on the screen, and you'll see a place where you can get a hold of the PDF of that book without any charge. So let's get into a couple of presuppositions that I have as we're getting into the study here. First off, you know, I don't know who is going to be watching this video, people from a variety of different backgrounds, but there's certain things that we need to kind of have already covered and agreed on before we can get too far with the topic of the investigative judgment. First of all, you have to believe in a certain approach to the Bible. There's a historical grammatical and a historical critical approach to it. A lot of people in academia approach the Bible from a historical critical approach, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, essentially this is an approach that looks at Scripture as something that is more of a human work as opposed to something that is originating from God. And so one of the consequences of that is that people who utilize the historical critical approach tend to not see the miracles in the Bible as something that is legitimate. And if you have that already as a presupposition before you are coming into a talk like this, you're going to have some issues. You know, predict the ability for a prophet to you know, tell us what's going to happen in the future is already off the table. So if you are coming at this from the perspective of the historical critical approach, there's some things that you would need to resolve and look at before you'd be able to agree with anything in this presentation. I also, I'm assuming that most people that are watching this believe that the Old Testament and the New Testament are authoritative. We're going to be drawing from both the Old and the New Testament. And lastly, the people who are watching this video need to be approaching the topic of eschatology and Bible prophecy from the historicist method of interpretation. Now, what do I mean by that? We got historical grammatical, historical critical, and now we got historicist. These are a bunch of words that sound very similar. Historicism is one of three main approaches to looking at apocalyptic prophecy, Bible prophecy. Briefly defined, historicism interprets Bible prophecies, especially in Daniel and Revelation, as unfolding continuously through history from the time of the prophet to the end of time. The preterist approach, on the other hand, interprets most prophecies as having been already fulfilled, especially by the events of the first century AD. And futurism sees most prophecies as being fulfilled in the future, especially in a short period of time before Christ's second coming. Now, a little bit more info on these three approaches. It's almost like, as an aside here, it's almost like wearing three different sets of glasses when you approach Bible prophecy. When you're looking at Daniel, when you're looking at Revelation, what set of lenses are you wearing? Is it green? Is it blue? Is it yellow? And depending on what set of lenses you put on when you're studying Daniel and Revelation, you're going to come to different conclusions. So where did these glasses come from to begin with? Historicism actually is the method that was utilized by Protestants during the Reformation to come to the conclusions that they did when they were interpreting Bible prophecy. Preterism actually and futurism, on the other hand, are actually methods of interpreting scripture that were developed by the Roman Catholic Church in the Counter-Reformation movement. Soon after the Council of Trent, Louis de Alcazar, Francisco Rivera, they developed these different ideas, preterism and futurism, to counteract the conclusions that the Protestants were coming to when they were studying the Bible. A lot of people were joining the Protestant movement. It was gaining ground, and the Catholic Church was not very happy with that, and so they developed these alternative methods of interpreting the Bible to, well, to help people to see things through their lenses, so to speak. I want to point out that preterism and futurism are alternatives to historicism. And I think that that's a really important point to bring out. Now, all three of these come to different conclusions that have big significance. Historicism, when interpreting Bible prophecy through the lenses of historicism, especially in Daniel and Revelation, historicists see the characteristics of the little horn as applying to the papacy. And that is significantly different than what preterism and futurism see. Preterism sees the Antichrist figure described in Daniel as applying to a ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes. And futurism sees the Antichrist as some kind of an individual that exists right before the end of time, who's likely a political leader. So those are definitely different views of Bible prophecy. And so my assumption again is that we're all looking at this through the historicist lens as we're beginning to study into the investigative judgment. So, and again, it's okay if you're not, but you can't get to calculus before you agree on basic mathematics, what 1 + 1 is, and addition, subtraction, multiplication. So these are some things that would definitely need to be resolved before we could come to an agreement on any conclusion further down the road. All right, let's keep on going here. The investigative judgment, definitely a doctrine that has been misunderstood and mischaracterized. I threw this picture in here because it's kind of symbolic of the feel of many people in the church when they think of the investigative judgment. They think of it as a doctrine which is, bringing a sense of fear and condemnation into their experience, which is really unfortunate, actually. I think that the investigative judgment is such a robust topic in the Bible. There's so many different angles to view it from. There's so many different facets of it. It's a really beautiful teaching, actually, and it's very deep. It's it's just a great topic, and I really wish that people, when they would you know, think about the investigative judgment, that it wouldn't have such a stigma associated with it as something that is um, full of foreboding, and you know, it's it's not, as we'll see. So let's keep going here. Over the years, there's been major detractors when it comes to the topic of the investigative judgment. Most people who are watching this video have probably heard of some of these. We're just going to go over a couple of them a little bit here. Desmond Ford, Raymond Cottrell, Robert Brinsmead, Walter Ray, Dale Ratzlaff. These are all individuals who have had a significant effect on people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and outside in terms of uh, helping them to disbelieve that this is a biblical topic. Desmond Ford was a prominent Australian Adventist theologian and professor, and he argued that the investigative judgment lacked biblical support, and it misinterprets Daniel 8:14 and undermines the gospel of justification by faith. He was eventually, his views were looked at by many theologians at the Glacier View Conference, and ultimately he was defrocked and was no longer a leading Adventist minister. Walter Ray, he was a former Adventist pastor, but the interesting thing about him is that his main issue wasn't so much with the investigative judgment as it was with Ellen White. And one of the big issues that he had with Ellen White was this idea that she was a plagiarist. Um, and there's been a lot of work that has been done by the church to show that that's actually not the case at all. Um, I've put right here a few resources. You can scan these, and these two QR codes will get you connected with some really good resources on the topic. The first one on the top, this QR code, is a 23-page document from the E.G. White estate that addresses the fallacies of Ellen White being a plagiarist. The second QR code will take you to a lot of good research documents that address the same thing, same issue of plagiarism, but also it looks into other connected issues such as her literary assistance, her infallibility, or I should say, the idea of infallibility, and Ellen White's relationship to the Bible. Um, on bullet point number one here, I just want to point this out, that when it comes to this idea of plagiarism, the idea that Ellen White took in an inappropriate way thoughts or elements from other books and incorporated them into her writings, I think it's important for us to understand that how inspiration works. And one of the key points with that is that um, God does not verbally dictate to people what they should say. Um, if he did, then I suppose we should only be reading the book, the Old Testament books in Hebrew and Aramaic, and the New Testament in Greek. But God does not give verbal inspiration. He doesn't tell them the exact words to say, but he gives them thought inspiration. He speaks to the prophets through the thoughts that they should share. And then they wrap that in their own language, in their own idioms, and they put that down for the rest of us to read. So this is substantiated by the fact that in Acts 17:28, 1 Corinthians 15:33, for example, you see Paul utilizing some thought content from non-biblical writers. And if God was into a verbal inspiration and telling Paul exactly what to write down, we would have a problem there, right? So, but that's not the case. Because God gives thought inspiration, he gives Paul and other inspired authors the thoughts. They can draw from other resources, as long as those sources that they're drawing from are illustrating the same thoughts and same ideas. And those other sources might actually put it in a very eloquent way that helps articulate the truth that the author themselves would not be able to put down. And so Luke chapter 1, verse 1 and 2 also is another really good example that helps substantiate this idea that originality is not necessarily the prerequisite for inspiration. Luke, for example, was when he was writing his gospel, was organizing um, different testimonies from people who were witnesses of what happened with Jesus's life, and putting them together to compose that book. He didn't necessarily write every word that was in there as something that originated from him. So, uh, that's an important element to understand as you're thinking about this accusation of plagiarism. Point number two here is that the Adventist Church has actually gone way out of the way to help answer these issues, to the point where it actually put together a study and tasked Fred Veltman to look at the Desire of Ages. I think they looked through, was it 13 or 15 chapters in Desire of Ages, with a fine-tooth comb to identify where there were places that Ellen White might have borrowed from other authors to get across what she was intending to say. And the outcomes of that study were very interesting. It showed that where there was borrowing from other authors, it was blended with her own verbiage. And the times when that happened, there was always a unique theological contribution from Ellen White in those areas where there was borrowing. So again, not that uniqueness is necessary to prove inspiration, uniqueness of, like the thoughts originating from the prophet and the verbiage, but even so, she did still have a unique theological contribution wherever there was borrowing that was happening. Um, Thirdly, she actually openly acknowledged utilization of sources. You can see that in some examples in the introductions of the Great Controversy, 1888 and 1911 editions. Use of sources and borrowing was very common in Ellen White's time, the 19th century. Nowadays, we have much more strict rules and regulations when it comes to citing our sources and giving attribution to people that we borrow from. But that was not the case back in the 19th century. So it's actually anachronistic to evaluate the 19th century by modern standards. We can't, look at Ellen White and her method of writing and utilizing resources and incorporating them into her writings and judge them by the standards that we have today. Um, they're it's just two different worlds. So. Ellen White was definitely not a plagiarist. I guess that's the bottom line point that we're making here. So again, here's some of the major critics, but we also have some people who have recently attacked the teaching of the investigative judgment. Alan Davis, a former vice president of Amazing Facts, who I've also had some personal dealings with at our home church here in California, and Ryan Day. Ryan Day just recently, in the past few weeks, has come out as questioning certain aspects of Adventist theology, and he is now, as far as I understand, no longer a Seventh-day Adventist. I actually know Ryan because I've been to 3ABN quite a few times to do interviews about a ministry that I was in charge of called Glow. And not that that I moved on from it in some kind of bad way. I work for Adventist World Radio now, in charge of literature at the General Conference. But anyway, I was at 3ABN quite a few times, and Ryan interviewed us, myself and other people I brought with me 2 times. So I got on the phone with Ryan this last week, and we talked for an hour and 45 minutes about his understandings of the investigative judgment. And I'm actually going to incorporate a few of his objections into this presentation. They don't hold water. Not any insult to him at all, but it just doesn't. You'll see what I'm talking about. So let's keep moving here. So is the investigative judgment actually biblical? Is it biblical? This is the question, because there's so many people that are against the idea of the investigative judgment. Well, from here forward, what we're going to do is we're going to look at basically 2 different questions. The presentation is going to focus on just answering these questions that we see on the screen. So we're constantly going to be coming back to this screen to make sure that we're answering these questions. So when you see this guy on this slide, that has his hand up and he's going like this, you know that we're coming back to the big picture questions that we're trying to answer in this presentation. So question number one is there a judgment that's chronologically positioned towards the end of the world in the Bible? Question number two is, what is the nature of that judgment? Is it global or is it local in scope? What is the scope of time that the judgment is looking at or it's considering? And is there an investigative element that's included? Okay, so we're going to be answering these questions. Let's start out with the first one. Let's dive right in. Now that our preamble is done, let's get right into the study. All right, is there a judgment towards the end? I'm going to show you 5 texts, and you can draw a conclusion for yourself. Does the Bible talk about a judgment that is towards the end of the world? Text number 1, Acts 17:31. Paul is speaking here, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. Okay? Text number 2, Acts 24:25. He reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. Third verse, Romans 2:16. God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. Fourth verse, Romans 14:10 through 12. For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow before me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then each of us shall give account of himself to God. And the last one, Hebrews 10:30, the Lord shall judge his people. Okay, let's take these 5 verses, just these 5, and let's analyze them a little bit. First thing that we can see by looking at these verses. So first point that we can derive here is that these are all New Testament texts. Pretty obvious. Nobody's going to argue with that. And they are all speaking, every one of them, of a yet future judgment. It is not a judgment that has happened in the past. It's not a judgment that's happened currently when those texts were written. It is talking about a judgment that is going to happen. So what this means is that there is a judgment, biblically speaking, after AD 31. When Christ ascended into heaven. Now, why does this matter? Because I thought that we were talking about asking the question, is there a judgment that is chronologically positioned towards the end of the world? Well, AD 31 is not the end of the world. So why are you bringing up this point? It's an important point because a lot of the people that are detractors and have argued against the investigative judgment have the idea that the judgment began in AD 31. Desmond Ford, from my conversation with Ryan Day, he's also a proponent of that idea. Although Ryan doesn't specify that it's necessarily the investigative judgment in the sense that Adventists understand it that happened in AD 31, but that there is a judgment of sorts that started happening in AD 31 moving forward. But one of Ford's main arguments, and when he was looking at Hebrews, is that he was trying to say that Hebrews is indicating that when Christ went to heaven, that Christ entered in within the second veil into the presence of God. Now, if Christ went into the second veil, the assumption there is that, according to Hebrews, the assumption there is that the investigative judgment began in AD 31, right? Because the high priest only goes behind the second veil into the most holy place during the Day of Atonement. Well, there's actually, again, the church has done some really good work on this just to show, the errors here. There is a solution to that. Richard Davidson, who's one of our theologians at Andrews University, has put together a book called Song in the Sanctuary. It's on the next slide, so I don't see it right now, but in this book, he basically shows that this verse in Daniel 6 that Ford was referencing regarding the veil that Christ went behind, that term for veil is not really able to be nailed down to linguistically to necessarily speaking of the second veil. So you're like, okay, well, that doesn't undo Ford's argument completely. I mean, it still could be, right? Well, the thing is that when you take this verse in Hebrews 6:19 and 20 that's talking about Christ going behind a veil, and you look at it in its literary context, you'll see that it is actually in a chiastic structure format. And this is what it looks like. You can see the chiasm right here. A, B, C, D, E, F is in the center, and all the way back out to A. So if you compare the A section and the A section on the terminal points of this chiastic structure, the veil that's referenced in Hebrews 6:19 and 20 is the same as the veil which is referenced in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19 and 20. Now, why does this matter? It's because when you look at the Hebrews 10 parallel segment, you actually see that there is a word there, consecrated, in Greek, which gives us a lot more information about what is happening here when Christ entered behind this veil. Now, Paul, it's well known that he drew and utilized the Septuagint, which is a Greek version of the Old Testament. And so if you look at that Greek word for consecrated, I guess I'll try and pronounce it, enkainzo. When you do a word search on that, you'll see that the only other place where that is used in the Septuagint, where Paul is drawing from regularly in Hebrews when he's referencing the Old Testament, the only other place where it's used is in number 7. And number 7 actually is talking about the dedication of the sanctuary. So get this. When the first sanctuary was established, or I should say the wilderness sanctuary during Moses' time, Moses consecrated the sanctuary before the services actually began. And during that consecration process, he himself went into the most holy place, and there was blood that was sprinkled. There was also blood that was sprinkled on the garments of the high priest, which was Aaron at the time. And so there was a consecration that happened. And yes, Moses did go behind the second veil to inaugurate it, to consecrate the sanctuary before it started. And so the idea is that Hebrews is talking about Jesus going into the presence of God behind the veil, yes, but it's not to start the investigative judgment. It's to consecrate the sanctuary, because Jesus had just gone up into heaven in AD 31, right? And he had sacrificed himself, and now he was transitioning from the lamb to becoming the priest, and the sanctuary service was starting in earnest in heaven. Now, Ellen White actually corroborates this idea in Signs of the Times, in this quote that we have here. She says, still bearing humanity, he, Christ, ascended to heaven, triumphant and victorious. He has taken the blood of the atonement into the holiest of all. Now, notice this is past tense. Ellen White is saying that Jesus has gone into the holiest of all, past tense, and sprinkled it upon the mercy seat and his own garments. The idea here of the verbiage here of Christ sprinkling the blood on the mercy seat and sprinkling it on his own garments, that is inauguration language. So she is also agreeing with this idea. And it's really neat to think about, actually, because it shows us that the parallelisms and the connectivity between what happened in the sanctuary on earth versus what happened in heaven is even more detailed than we thought. There was an inauguration that happened a certain way on earth, and with the earthly sanctuary, and there was an inauguration that also happened in heaven that was very similar. If anybody would like to get a hold of the resources that I'm talking about, the book Song for the Sanctuary by Richard Davidson. There's also some Adventist Theological Society articles that I can send. Just shoot me an email here. There's my email, liferefinder@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to send those over to you so that you can look through it yourself. You're going to want to look around page 417. So head on over to page 417, and you can look at this issue of inauguration in the sanctuary in heaven. Okay, let's keep going here. Back to our 5 verses we looked at. Is there a judgment that's chronologically positioned towards the end of the world? And we have seen from those 5 verses that this is something that is There is a judgment described in the Bible after AD 31. We also see from these 5 verses that we looked at that the judgment that is talked about involves believers. In Romans 14:10 through 12, Paul tells believers that they will stand before Christ's judgment seat. And he also tells us in Hebrews 10, verse 30, that the Lord shall judge his people. Now, this is you know, something that Adventists who are watching this presentation fully understand and have heard before. But it also is a judgment which involves non-believers. In Acts 17:31, Paul's speaking to the Athenians, and he says that God will judge the world. And Paul reasoned with Felix, a pagan Roman, in Acts 24:25, reasoning of judgment to come. Paul is obviously talking to the Athenians and to Felix because, even though they're not believers, because they are going to be included in that judgment. Now, before somebody gets a stone and maybe gets ready to throw it at me, when I say included in the judgment, the investigative judgment, well, let me just say the judgment is multi-phase, if we will remember that. There, according to the understanding that we see from the Bible, there's a phase of the investigation where heaven is looking at the lives of Christians and believers, or people who have confessed Christ before the second coming. And then, after the second coming, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, the believers are going to be looking at the lives of those who were sinners, and the lives of even the fallen angels. So, yes, the judgment does involve non-believers too. We're just talking about different phases of it in these 5 verses. So, is there a judgment that is chronologically positioned towards the end of the world? Well, so far we've seen that there is a judgment after AD 31, but can we get a little bit further out time-wise, closer to the end of the world? Yes, we can. And we are going to, from here forward, hone in on Daniel chapter 7, because that is going to give us much more explicit information about a judgment happening towards the end of the world. And I want to just say right now that there are several reasons why we're going to focus exclusively on Daniel 7. There's a lot of different evidence in Scripture that we could look at in a variety of different places in the Bible. We could even go, of course, to Daniel chapter 8. But there's several reasons why we're going to stay mostly in Daniel chapter 7. Number one, because Daniel 7 spells out the chronology of the judgment extremely clearly. Number two, I want to mitigate the possibility of anybody saying that this substantiation of the investigative judgment was able to be done because things were taken out of context. So if we try to squeeze as much juice as we can, so to speak, just out of Daniel 7 and derive all of our points and all of our reasoning from just that one chapter, then it makes the case that we are putting together much stronger, because you cannot argue that things were not looked at in context. Or I should say it's less likely that you can make that argument. So we're going to hone in on Daniel chapter 7 primarily. I mean, you have the same author, you have the same thematic context, you have the same vision, you have the same underlying language. Everything is about context. And staying in Daniel 7 is really going to help us create a clear picture of the judgment, and also make it more bulletproof from people who would want to disagree with our interpretation. So, having said that, let's look at Daniel 7 to answer our question about the chronology and the placement of the investigative judgment and the flow of history. We're going to breeze through the first 8 verses. This is stuff that we don't need to spend time really looking at. First 8 verses talk about the lion, the bear, the leopard, the beast, and the horns. We all understand that, those are symbols. Again, assuming that you're approaching this from a historicist standpoint, we understand that these are symbols that represent Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and then divided Rome. And then you have the little horn representing the papacy. But we're going to we're not going to focus on that stuff. We're going to focus really from verse 8 to 28. Verses 8 to 28. The really neat thing about this is that as we hone in on this section, we have some really good news, because God gives us a lot of information a lot of information here about the judgment, and that's going to help us make some really good points. Not only does he give us a lot of information, he actually repeats himself three times. Three times. Okay, so from verse 8 to verse 28, you see a description of the players in the judgment and the judgment itself and the repercussions of the judgment being described three times. And I think it's because God, he did that because three times because he wants us to understand what he's saying here. So let's have a look at those different repetitions. Okay, here we go. This is a chart I put together that talks about the three different repetitions in Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7 verse, first column, Daniel 7, 8 through 14 is the first flow that we see. The second column is Daniel chapter 7 verse 20 through 22. And then Daniel chapter 7 verse 20 through 24 through 27 is the third repetition that we see. In the first repetition, Daniel 7, 8 through 14, Daniel is just giving the initial description that he sees of the beasts, the horn, I'm sorry, not the beasts, we're past those, but he's talking about the horn and its actions, then the judgment, and then the outcomes. And then Daniel chapter 7, verse 20 through 22, Daniel is repeating himself as he's gearing up to ask a question from the angel. But as he repeats himself, he describes the same vision that he just had, and he gives additional details. And then in the third column, we see that the angel itself is now giving an interpretation of the original vision that is in column number 1. Okay, so we're not talking about three different visions. We're talking about one vision that's repeated twice and then is broken down by an angel a third time. So all three of these repetitions are very important. They deal with the same vision. They deal with the same judgment. That is key. Same judgment. Okay. And the third repetition is actual explanation by the angel. There's no need to actually do much interpretation because the angel does the interpretation for us. The third repetition is the most contextually and hermeneutically explanatory and interpretive of the three. And yeah, it is here that we get in the third column something very important. But before I get to that, I just want to slowly go over this. There's some people watching this presentation that maybe are not very familiar with Daniel 7. They're not very familiar with this topic of the little horn and so on. You know, I get that. So let's just look at column 1. Nice and slow, okay? So in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8 through 14, Daniel gives a description, his first time through, of this vision. And he describes the little horn power rising after the description of the beasts in the first 8 verses. The 3 horns, there are 3 horns that are uprooted, and by the little horn, as the little horn is coming into power and ascending, it uproots 3 horns that were there before it of the 10, right? Because you got the first beast, the second beast, the third beast, the fourth beast. The fourth beast has, then the focus of the vision focuses on 10 horns that are on that beast. And then 3 of those 10 are uprooted by the little horn. And then it describes something that the little horn does. And it says that the little horn is speaking great words. Immediately after that, you have verse 9 and 10. The Ancient of Days comes and is seated. There's thousands of thousands sitting before him. Thousands are ministering to him. The court is seated. The books are opened. You have multiple thrones being talked about here, not just the throne of the Ancient of Days. That's all in verse 9 and 10. That's very key, very key. And then afterward are the outcomes of that judgment. The beast's body is burned, talking about the fourth beast. And the Son of Man receives a kingdom. Oh, we all know who the Son of Man is, and that's Jesus. Okay, so now let's go look at the second column. Little horn rises, same idea. He just mentions it twice. 3 horns are uprooted. He mentions that again. The horn speaks great words. He mentions that again. Now he adds a new idea here, and that is that the little horn persecutes the saints. Now that is not in the first description. It's in the second description. Now, that doesn't mean that the first description is different and that little horn in the first description didn't persecute the saints. No. That's not how it works. You see, there's a there's something we need to understand about Bible prophecy, especially apocalyptic prophecy. And by apocalyptic, I mean prophecy that is global in its reach and starts with the prophet's time and moves forward all the way until the end of time. And the characteristic that we need to understand is that in Bible prophecy like that, there's a principle of repetition and enlargement. Uh, Prophecy will often repeat itself, and the second time that it repeats itself, it gives more information in it, or it hones in with more and greater detail on a certain aspect of the prophecy when it repeats it a second time. It's kind of like a gigantic Hebrew parallelism. By comparing the two repetitions, you can make theological deductions. And we see this in a larger way with Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, right? In Daniel 2, you have this image, this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and the different elements that are part of this image represent Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and then divided Rome. Well, in Daniel 7, you have the exact same concepts, the same entities described, but it's using different and more detailed symbols to give us additional information. Now you've got a lion, you've got a bear, you've got a leopard, you've got this terrible beast, and each one of these beasts are just, there's much more information associated with them, which help us to identify which nations they're describing, as opposed to the Daniel 2 description, symbolic description, where you don't have as much detail. So the leopard, for example, which represents Greece, had 4 heads. So that's a symbol of the Alexander the Great when he died and his kingdom was given to the 4 generals underneath of him. We don't see that in the parallel symbol in Daniel chapter 2. It's just the belly and thighs of brass, right? So it doesn't tell us anything about the 4 generals necessarily, symbolically. So Daniel 7 repeats Daniel 2, repetition, but Daniel 7 gives more information, enlargement. So repetition and enlargement. And that's what we see happening here in Daniel 7. We have 3 repetitions of the same vision, and each time it's giving additional information. So we have a persecution of the saints that the little horn is now described as doing, and then you see that the Ancient of Days comes. So we have the same picture of judgment, but the second repetition here, this in the second column, it doesn't give as much information as the first one, actually, interestingly. The first column, you have the entirety of verse 9 and 10, which are describing this judgment. But in the second column, it's just a passing acknowledgement to the judgment happening after this persecution of the saints. And then, of course, you have the outcomes of the judgment. There is a judgment that's for the saints and the kingdom given to the saints. And those are different outcomes that are described there than what's described in the first column. But that's okay. It's still the same judgment. And if anybody's doubting that, well, we'll see that the third column ties it all together. So going to the third column, the little horn rises, same as what we've seen before. There's 3 horns uprooted, same as what we've seen before. The little horn speaks great words, same as what we've seen before. And now, additional idea is added in that the little horn thinks to change times and laws. That's an additional detail. It also talks about the persecution of the saints. But this time, look at what is added here in the third repetition. It talks about the amount of time that the little horn is going to persecute the saints. And that is for a time, times, and half a time. Again, a time, times, plural, and half a time. My pinky is bent in half. So that's 1, 2, 3.5 times. Well, we don't need to get into the weeds here with breaking down how that works, but a time, times, and half a time. With the Jewish calendar, if each time is representing a year and then half a year, and the Jewish calendar's, I said I wasn't going to get into the weeds here, but if the Jewish calendar is 360 days for a year, and 3.5 years times 360 days is 1,260 days. Now, the only way for this to make sense in this prophecy is to apply something called a day for a year principle, where a day in the context of apocalyptic prophecy is representing a year. There are a lot of people, especially the people who are against the investigative judgment. There are a lot of people that have an issue with that. And the books that I referenced you to at the beginning from the Daniel and Revelation Study Committee have entire sections that go over really showing why we use the day for a year principle and how we apply it, why we apply it certain places and not others. And it really makes a lot of solid sense. But, you know, honestly, the church doesn't really need to defend itself that much. I mean, if you look at the evangelical world, you look at people in the general Christian world that apply the Daniel 9 prophecy to Jesus and his first coming, they're also using this idea of applying a day for a year. 490 days, well, you have 490 years that are being described there in Daniel chapter 9. So it's not just Adventists. This is not just a unique idea to Adventists. So in order for again, for that Daniel 9 prophecy to work, to predict the timing of the coming of Jesus, people in the Christian world in general understand that you need to utilize that principle of a day for a year. So anyway, back to this. Persecution of the saints is going to happen for 1,260 years. Time times and half a time is 1,260 years. Now, going back to our little chart here, we are going to fill in a couple more things. So the papacy and the little horn exists. The last thing we looked at. And the activities are such that the little horn or the papacy is persecuting God's people for 1,260 years, or 3.5 times. And we know that that terminates. I'm not going to go into the details of 538 to 1798 or whatever, but just for the discussion here, we know that that terminates in 1798. Okay, so the little horn received its deadly wound, borrowing language from Revelation 13, in 1798. Okay, so now what that means is that after 1798, there's the judgment. Okay, if you didn't follow that, let's go back to our little chart here. Notice the 3 different colors we have on the chart. The first color is orange, and that's talking about the activities of the little horn. Then after that is green, talking about the judgment scene or references to the judgment scene. And then the last column is the outcomes of the judgment. So in every single repetition, without exception, this is the order of how it goes. Is that after the persecution of the saints in the last 2 columns, right? Or the more general description of what the horn did and its evils, you have the judgment. The judgment doesn't come before. It's not, dispersed in the midst of the language describing the actions of the little horn. It's after the description of the earthly actions of the little horn. And the most specific, the most descriptive, which is the 3rd column, you have the information that the persecution lasts until 1798, and then it says the judgment sits. So we know that the judgment, there is a judgment that is described in Daniel 7, most fully broken down in verse 9 and 10, as we see in the first column, but referenced in the 2nd and 3rd column as well, the same judgment. That judgment happens after 1798 sometime. It doesn't say that it happens at 1798, but we know that just sequentially speaking, 1798 comes before the judgment. Okay? So, and then of course you have the like I showed, the 3rd section, which are the outcomes of the judgment at the bottom, and that is that the horn is destroyed, there's judgment for the saints, and they're given the kingdom, and the kingdom is also given to the Son of Man. Okay? All right. So the question is there a judgment that is chronologically positioned toward the end of the world? Well, what do you think? I think so. We've proven, number 1, that there is a judgment explicitly mentioned in the New Testament as happening after AD 31 as a global judgment involving believers and unbelievers, pagans and Christians, and Jews, everybody, God's people. We've also seen that there is a judgment that happens, sequentially speaking, after 1798. You cannot argue otherwise, unless you want to. I mean, if you want to get into questioning when the placement of the time, times, and half time is, okay, fine. But that's a different discussion. Um, and also, I'm going to say, just to get a little bit more specific in terms of time frame, that the judgment's outcomes require that the judgment, or at least a certain aspect of it, terminates at the end of this world. Okay? Now, what do I mean by that? So, looking back at our chart here, this column, the last line that we see here about the outcomes, the horn is destroyed, the judgments for the saints, the kingdom's given to the Son of Man, that is describing the end of the world. It is. There's no way around that, and I can prove that to you. So let's look at this. Okay. First off, I'd like to go back here. Well, it's not letting me go back. Oh, maybe I can click right here. No, it's not letting me go back. Anyway, first off, the new kingdom that is established in Daniel 7 is described as being universal. Okay, it's everywhere. It's not like just one location in the world, like Rome was only in part of one place of the world, or Babylon was only in one place in the world. Verse 14, Daniel 7 says, "And there was given to him," speaking of Jesus, "dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him." Verse 27 elaborates in the third repetition, "And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, and all dominions shall serve and obey him." Speaking of Jesus. This is that language is reminiscent of Daniel chapter 2, because remember, Daniel 7 and Daniel 2 are parallel to each other, and they're describing the same events. Daniel 2:35, talking about that stone, "And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." Not part of the earth, the whole earth. Daniel 2:44, "The kingdom shall not be left to other people, but shall destroy these kingdoms." So there's the kingdoms that were before will not be anymore, and there's only going to be one kingdom left, and that is the stone or mountain kingdom. That's the kingdom that's described more explicitly in Daniel 7 as being given to the saints and to Jesus, the Son of Man. Okay, so we know that this is the judgment terminates at the end of the world, because the kingdom that's described there is universal. It's not like there's some other kingdom that continues to exist afterwards, and Jesus is going to come later. Secondly, the new kingdom that's described in Daniel 7 lasts forever. There is no end to it. Verse 14 of Daniel 7, "His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed." Again, the language of Daniel 2, "And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and shall stand forever." Now, I said earlier that we're only going to stick with Daniel 7, and I'm kind of breaking my promise, I guess, by referencing Daniel 2 a little bit here. But that's okay. You don't need Daniel 2 to substantiate the points of the universality of the kingdom, as well as its eternal nature. We've been deriving texts from Daniel 7 on those points. But Daniel 2 is definitely supplementary. And I think a person that would probably want to argue that Daniel 2 and 7 are not parallel to each other, but they just have an uphill climb to make to try and make that argument and come up with some other plausible explanation for why they are so similar. Verse 27 of Daniel 7, back to Daniel 7, "Whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom." All right, so we've seen that the judgment's outcomes require that it is the judgment will actually end at the end of the world. So because the new kingdom is universal, the new kingdom will last forever. And lastly, it also describes the horn itself as being destroyed in a different way than the other kingdoms before it. The beast's body was given to the burning flame, verse 11. Now, that language is interesting because it connects you to the second coming. For example, if you look in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 7 through 9, talking about the second coming, verse 8, "In flaming fire taking vengeance on those who do not know God and those who do not obey the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ." these shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. So you got this picture of Jesus coming a second time at the end of the world, and his mere presence is something that consumes in flaming fire his enemies. To be a little bit more specific, though, actually in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8, it talks about the Antichrist. You know, the Antichrist in Daniel 7 is being looked at here too. And it talks about the Antichrist being destroyed in fire, just like we saw in Daniel 7. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. So the beast's body is given to the burning flame. That language there is indicative of the second coming in verse 11. And then there's a contrast that's also made, and it shows that it talks about the dominion of the first beasts being taken away from them, but that their lives are prolonged. But it's different with the little horn, because the little horn is at the same time that it has its dominion taken away, it is also destroyed. Okay, so there's a difference there. If you think about this, it's also an indication that we're talking about the end of the world. One of the outcomes of the judgment being, the destruction of the beast is an indication that we're talking about this phase of the judgment being done at the end of the world. The beasts that were destroyed. Take, for example, when Babylon transferred over to being taken over by Medo-Persia. That's a story where you see that, let's see, Belteshazzar was throwing this feast, and, the handwriting on the wall and so on happens, and Daniel comes in and interprets it, and then the kingdoms are changed out. Not everybody in Babylon was destroyed. They weren't all killed. Daniel's a perfect example of that. Daniel transitioned from living in the Babylonian kingdom to the Medo-Persian kingdom, and not only did he transition and live there, he exerted a great level of influence, the most influential person almost in the entire kingdom, to the point where the other people around him that were in power were jealous of him and threw him into the lion's den because they were jealous of his influence. So the point I'm bringing out here is that even though these prior beasts, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, they were, overtaken by other kingdoms or torn apart in the example of Rome, or in the instance of Rome, their influence continued because the people who were part of those prior cultures continued to exist. So their influence continued. But the contrast, though, is with the little horn. Everybody who is associated with that entity is cut off. It's done. It's not that the dominion is taken away and then they're allowed to live the horn is allowed to live for a while. No, the dominion is taken away at the same time that the horn is destroyed. That is the outcome of the judgment in Daniel 7. So, this is, like I have here in the notes, what manner of persons ought we to be in godliness? I mean, when this new kingdom arrives, the eternal one, the global one, there's no sinners that are transferring from one to the other. The only people that are transferring over are the ones that are righteous. It's a clean cut. There's no more influence from the prior kingdoms in the new kingdom. It's only the influence of the Lamb in the hearts of the people who are the saints. So it's a real sobering idea as you think about that. As a side note, Revelation 13, the first beast that's described that comes out of the water, it's an amalgamated beast. It has elements of the kingdoms and the beasts that are described in Daniel 7 as part of its body. That's yet another indication that the prior influence of the beasts before the little horn are a part of the little horn and the beast that is lasting until the end of the world when it's destroyed. So I hadn't seen that before this study, but that's definitely a strong point to add to that idea. Okay, so again, our summary here, there's a judgment after AD 31, there's a judgment after 1798 to be more specific, and the judgment's outcomes require that the judgment terminates at the ends of this world. where there is a new kingdom that exists, that's set up, that is both universal and lasts forever, and the horn itself is destroyed. Okay, so is there a judgment chronologically positioned toward the end of the world? I would say that the answer to that is a resounding yes. Like my little graphics there. Took me a while to figure that one out. All right, let's move on to the second question then. What is the nature of the judgment? Now, we don't need to answer the first point already, which is it global? Is the judgment global or is it local? We've already looked at that. The outcomes of the judgment are global. There's a new kingdom that's established, and it takes up the whole world. Thank goodness. Don't want to have sin living off in Antarctica or something like that, you know? But we do have another question, and that is, what is the scope of time that is considered by the investigative judgment? And I think this is an important one for us to understand as we're thinking about the nature of the judgment. Okay, so here's how we're going to figure that out. There's a three-point line of logic that we're going to follow, okay? And it goes like this. The judgment outcomes reveal who is involved as the focus, and who is involved helps us establish the time frames, all right? Now, if you don't understand what I just said there, I'm going to put it into a chart. We're going to fill out a chart. As you can tell, I like charts. Okay, judgment outcomes. We're going to fill in this column first. What were the outcomes of the judgment? Next, that will help us determine who was involved, who was looked at by the judgment. And then who is looked at is going to help us determine what time frames. Okay, all right, so let's fill in the first one, which is judgment outcomes. Going back to our chart here, what are the outcomes of the judgment? First one, the beast body is burned in verse 11, and the horn is destroyed in verse 26. Now, some people might look at this and say, well, what are you going to put in the column there? Is it the beast or is it the horn that's destroyed? Well, I'm going to put the horn, and here's why. For two reasons. Number one is, going back to what we mentioned earlier, the principle of repetition and enlargement. Verse 26 is more specific than verse 11. There is a repetition, and in verse 26, the horn is described, and it's just a more detailed look at the beast, which is mentioned in verse 11. Also, verse 26 is an actual angelic interpretation of verse 11. Okay, and now if that's not enough for you in terms of reasoning, there's actually a chiastic structure built in here, which helps us understand another reason why the term beast was used instead of horn. Daniel 7, chapter 7, verse 1 through 15 is built in a chiastic structure. I'm not sure if this is actually in any book. It might be in those books that I recommended earlier, but this is just something I saw as I was putting this together. Daniel 7, by the way, does have a few chiastic structures in it. I don't remember which ones they are, but I'm going to show you the one that I saw here. You can see Daniel's statement about the vision in verse 1, Daniel's statement about the vision in verse 15. So the chiastic structure is kind of building together like a pyramid like this. The terminal points are at the bottom, and then is building up to the apex, which is judgment scene in verse 9 and 10. Okay, but when you compare these to each other, and I'm not going to describe it right here. You can take some time to look at this, take a screenshot of it or whatever, and digest it yourself. But Daniel in verse 11, the second half of verse 11 and 12, is talking about the demise of the beast and how its body was burned, right? Well, that's parallel with Daniel speaking about the rise of the four beasts. So on the one hand, you got the rise of the beasts, and on the other hand, you have the demise of the beast. So because of the literary context here and the fact that verse 11 is plugged into the context of this chiastic structure, there's a reason why Daniel described the destruction of the enemy of God there as the beast instead of the little horn, because it fits the literary format better. Now, if you didn't understand what I said, just back up and listen to it again, or look at the chiastic structure more thoroughly here, or maybe I just, need to get better at explaining things. But it's definitely a solid reason as to why the beast is described there instead of the horn. So what are we going to put into the chart? Judgment outcome number one is that the horn is destroyed, not the beast, not pagan Rome. Pagan Rome is not existing until the end of the world, and then it's destroyed with fire. It's the little horn that's destroyed with fire at the end of the world. Okay, outcome number 2 of the judgment is what's circled here. Judgment is given to the saints. Kingdom is given to the saints. Kingdom given to the saints. You can see that my little circle here in this PowerPoint recording is blocking, obscuring some of the chart, and that's really unfortunate, but it is what it is. So judgment is given to the saints. All right, so we're going to put that down. The kingdom is given to the saints as an outcome. And then the last one is that the Son of Man receives a kingdom. We see that in the first and the third repetition. The Son of Man receives a kingdom. So we're going to put that into our chart here. Jesus is given a kingdom. Now, the second column is going to be very simple to put together. Who is involved? Well, if a horn is destroyed as one of the outcomes of the judgment, who is the judgment looking at? If it gives a punishment or a judgment or a repercussion to the horn, who would then be looked at? It only makes sense that the horn is looked at, right? This is not rocket science. This is very simple. All right? The kingdom is given to the saints. So who is the judgment looking at? The saints. Okay? And this is really important to understand because some people say that the judgment only focuses on the little horn. And they say that the investigative judgment does not involve the saints. This is a big, and I might be getting ahead of myself here, but this is a big contention of Ryan when I was talking to him, Ryan Day. And it's a contention of others as well. I believe also Desmond Ford. The judgment does not involve the saints. That God's people are already known, that their sins are forgotten with that language, and they don't come into judgment, right? Well, that's not what Daniel's saying. Daniel 7 is saying that the saints are part of the judgment, and they're looked at. Okay, and if you're only looking at the first repetition, column 1, Daniel 7 verses 9 and 10, and then 11 and 12. You're gonna see, as Ryan was trying to point out, that the judgment is only talking about the little horn receiving punishment. But what is excluded there is the idea that the vision is repeated 3 times. And when you look at all 3 of those, then you have a bigger view of all the outcomes of the judgment, not just the outcome that relates to the little horn. Okay, who else is involved? Jesus, the Son of Man. Okay, now let's look at time frames in our last column. Okay, if the judgment is looking at the little horn, would it make sense that the judgment would be looking at things, would be looking at issues of the little horn before the little horn existed? No. So the judgment is looking at the little horn during the time which the little horn is looking at evidence of the little horn to make decisions from evidence that it derives from the life or the time period of the existence of the little horn. Okay, so when did the little horn come into existence? Well, you can argue 538. I'm going to put down 508 because that is the first time from the 1290 prophecy in Daniel chapter 12, the 1290 prophecy that we see as an entity, the little horn having something that is worthy of being judged actually being described. That was a mouthful, but let's just take 508. You can take 538 if you want, but I'm going to say that the investigative, that the judgment is looking at the little horn's activities all the way back to 508. So even though the judgment happened at a time after 1798, that's when it started, from what we've seen, the scope of what it's looking at is it's looking at an entity that goes back to at least 508. Okay? The kingdom is given to the saints. Now, here's a good question. This is a very important one. In fact, this is the main reason why we're bringing up this aspect of the scope of the nature, or the scope of the judgment is with regards to the saints. So how far back is the judgment looking at the saints? One might want to argue that the judgment here is only looking at the saints that are in the immediate context of being described as being persecuted by the little horn. Okay? The problem with that idea is that it doesn't match the outcome. Okay, so what is the outcome? The outcome is that the kingdom is given to the saints. Right? That's mentioned, what was it, 2 or 3 times in the chart? So here you have heaven, you have the new earth, and what saints are going to receive that? It's not just the saints that were being persecuted during the 1260 from 538 to 1798. It's the saints that go all the way back to Adam. So who is receiving the kingdom? Which saints? Is it just this amount of saints, the ones from during the time of the persecution of the little horn? Or are the saints that are receiving the kingdom every saint from Adam to the end? Obviously, it's the second. So that means then that the saints that are being looked at are not just the saints that are being persecuted by the little horn, but it's also the rest of the saints, all the way back to Adam forward. That then means that the investigative or the judgment that's described here has happening after 1798 has a large scope of view in mind. It's not just looking at things during the lifetime of the little horn. It's looking at issues and who is going to be part of the kingdom, and judgments related to individuals all the way back to the beginning of the Great Controversy as it happened here on Earth. Now, why would he do that? Well, it makes sense if you think about it, because this is the judgment, this is the last judgment that happens before the end of the world. It culminates in the end of this world and a transition to the new one. So it has to look at who is going to be transitioning over to the new kingdom that is eternal and that's global. And so it has to take into account everybody. It's not just looking at a transition from one kingdom to another in a small way, like when Babylon transitioned over to Medo-Persia, and the handwriting on the wall said, "You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting," which, by the way, is another example of an investigative judgment. Babylon was weighed in the balances, and only after it was weighed in the balances was it found wanting. And then the result of that was that the kingdom was divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So you have a perfect example even within the book of Daniel contextually that talks about an investigative judgment when we see a transition from one beast to another. But again, those beasts, their dominion was taken away, but Babylon's dominion was taken away, but it was allowed to live for a season at a time. Okay, so anyway, let's keep moving here, filling out the chart. And the last one is time frames. Now, on this one, I'm not going to really spend a lot of time here, because I think in order to answer this, you got to get into you really need to get into Daniel chapter 8, which is not really the focus of this study here. Daniel chapter 8 really gets a lot more into the details of the controversy between the little horn and the prince of the hosts, or Jesus himself, because there is a direct attack between the little horn and Christ, and that's, as I said, more fully explained in Daniel chapter 8. I will say, though, that you can just take a look at this, maybe take a screenshot of this and look at it a little bit more later, but you can even see from Daniel 7 that the Antichrist is making an attack against Christ. So in one sense, you have the judgment as it relates to Christ being passive, because once the books are looked at, the judgment is done, and it's determined who's going to be in the kingdom of God and who's not. In that sense, in a passive way, Christ receives a kingdom, because now heaven has agreed upon who is going to be in the new kingdom. So now Christ has a kingdom, because you can't have a kingdom without subjects, people a part of it. So in a sense, Christ is passively part of the judgment, because he receives a kingdom. But there's another sense in which it's a more direct contrast between the little horn who's claiming certain things versus the Son of Man. So, judgment is in a sense kind of made in favor of Christ over the little horn, at least as far as I can see. So I'm not going to tread too heavily here. You can take a look at this and make what you want of it. But back to the chart here, I'm just going to say for now that the time frames as it relates to Jesus are not applicable. Maybe it just goes so far back as the little horn itself is, speaking blasphemous words against God and comparing itself to Christ. So that would take you back to, 508, 538. But definitely it wouldn't be taking into scope, Christ's eternal preexistence. Um, I don't think Christ is not looked at in that sense in the judgment. Okay, so we have covered what the scope of time is that's going to be considered, and seen that it goes all the way back to the beginning of the great controversy here on earth, Adam forward. The saints are being looked at. And then the last question, which is the investigative element. Is there an investigative element in the judgment? Many people say no. I think there is. Okay. Before we get into the evidence for that, I want to just make something clear. I want to look at this little chart here. Yes, another chart. This breaks down, it's a table of epistemic standards or standards of proof. Okay, when you're making a conclusion in anything, not just theology, but in philosophy or logic or different areas of study and thought, there's different standards that are required when you're making deductions, when you're coming up with ideas. At the very bottom, in the weakest area, we have speculation, and that can be described as a claim with no real supporting evidence. It's just a guess. After that, you have a possibility, which is a little bit stronger than speculation, and is a claim that could be true. There's no contradiction, but there's also no evidence yet. Plausibility is described as a claim that makes logical sense and could be true, although unproven. Reasonable suspicion, there is, in this example, there's a hint of supporting evidence. This term is often used in law. A preponderance of evidence means that something is more likely true than not, greater than 50%. That's used in civil law. Clear and convincing evidence means that something is highly probable, it's well supported, but not absolute. Beyond a reasonable doubt means that there's no reasonable alternatives that remain. It's used in criminal law. And finally, at the highest level, or the lowest on the chart, we have certainty or proof. This is near absolute or near absolute truth, virtually unquestionable, and it's rarely used in debate outside of math and logic. So just to put a little bit more skin on this idea, I'm going to throw up a couple of statements to you, and we can see where these fall. Number one, the sun will rise tomorrow. Where on the scale would you put that? Would that be speculation? No. It would definitely be higher than that. Would it be certainty or proof? Some people could argue that. Beyond a reasonable doubt? Probably more likely. Aliens exist. Where would that fall? Plausibility? There's definitely, some people would say there's evidence, some people would say there's not. So you could say maybe a preponderance or a reasonable suspicion, all the way down to speculation. Just kind of depends on what you think is evidence or not, I guess. Gravity makes objects fall. I would put that right up there around certainty or proof. God exists. Now that's a big one. People are going to have completely different ideas on that as to where that falls on the scale. Now, keeping this epistemic standard scale in mind, let's look at the evidence for the idea that the judgment that is in Daniel 7 has an investigative element. And we'll see, where do these fall? Okay, number one, only after the heavenly court judgment scenes do we see judgment carried out. This implies two phases, an investigative phase of the judgment, then an executive phase of the judgment. Okay, look at the chart again. Before you have anything in blue, which are results of the judgment described, you always have the judgment described in the green. That's in all three repetitions. Okay, so that implies that there is a investigative and an executive or carrying out of the judgment element. Two phases. Point number two, the judgment sat. That phrase, the judgment sat, that implies deliberation. Okay, that is, of course, inferred, but I would say that it is probable. If you're going to look at that phrase, it is probable that there is deliberation involved in the judgment when it says that the judgment sat. Okay, the immediate context right after it says the judgment sat says the books are opened, and I think this is verse 10 we're looking at now. Uh, books are opened for a reason. They're not just opened for no reason. And that is because they're to be looked at. So, again, this is inferred, but I think that this is probable. The books are related to the judgment. That's also inferred and probable because they're part of the judgment scene in verse 9 and 10, and they likely contain information to enable decision making. That is also inferred, but it's not saying that explicitly. Okay, let's just be as accurate as possible. Okay. Um, in the judgment scene, verse 9 and 10, you see that there are individuals that are sitting on thrones. Now, if you look at verses 9 and 10, actually, just as a side note, these books from the Daniel Revelation Study Committee bring out some interesting points here that verse 9 and 10 are built in a small chiastic structure, which, when you look at it from that viewpoint, implies that it's the thousands that are ministering to him. It's the angelic hosts that are participating in the judgment, and that perhaps those thrones are for them, in metaphorical language, for them to be giving their decisions. So, but anyway, the point that I'm making here is people are described as individuals are described as sitting on thrones during the judgment, and that implies authority. A throne implies authority, and you need authority to make decisions in a courtroom. Revelation 20 verse 4, Matthew 19:28, those are very clearly spelling out people making decisions when they're sitting on thrones, decisions related to judgments. Okay. And then last, I'm going to share with you what I think is probably the most clear evidence for there being an investigative element in Daniel 7's judgment, and that is verse 22. It says that judgment is made in favor of the saints. Now, I would call that near proof. That's my own personal view of it. It's not just probable, but it's near proof, in my opinion. And just in case somebody thinks that, the phrase judgment is made in favor of the saints in verse 22, that is, somehow just not there or a mistranslation. This is actually what it says in the Young's literal translation, which is one of the most literal English translations available. It has a really close correspondence with the original languages, which in this portion of the Old Testament in Daniel is in Aramaic. It's not in Hebrew. So this is what it says: until the Ancient of Days hath come, and the judgment is given to the saints of the Most High. So that does the phrase there, the judgment is given, does not mean, what it does not mean is that at that time the saints are now put in charge of the judgment. That's not what it means. Actually, the series of books from Daniel Revelation Study Committee bring that out. They show that from the Aramaic. But what the phrase actually means, in our third bullet point here, the judgment is given to the saints, it literally reflects the Aramaic, which can be read, that is, a verdict in favor of the saints was rendered. Okay, now, follow this. How can you have a verdict made in favor of the saints if there is no looking at the saints beforehand? It just doesn't make sense. This is a judgment. And a judgment, the very nature of a judgment is that evidence is weighed and decisions are made, and then a verdict is rendered. So if a verdict was made in favor of a particular individual, a saint, it also means that that saint was looked at by that same judgment to come to that conclusion. You can argue something different if you'd like, but I think that is really, really solid evidence that there is an investigative element in the judgment. So there's some additional substantiating or supporting evidence for this. As I mentioned earlier, the kingdoms that were before um, described, the ones that are described in the first eight verses of Daniel 7, there was an investigation that happened with them before they were overthrown. And also, there's a really kind of interesting parallel or contrast between the little horn's activities and the judgment in heaven, described in verse 9 and 10, in that the horn claimed to be a replacement for God. It's an antichrist figure, and as such, it did try to mimic God, and the Inquisition and the questioning of God's people, and the persecution of which eventuated in the persecution of them, is interesting in that it looks like an actual parallel to the investigative judgment itself. I mean, here you have this horn, and it's persecuting God's people. You have the Inquisition happening, and they're rendering verdicts which are on the side of error instead of truth, and they're destroying God's people and saying you're not worthy to be part of the kingdom of this world, so you're going to be destroyed. But then God comes along, it's like poetic justice, and he starts his own judgment in heaven, and the little horn is investigated, and the little horn is the one that's condemned, but then the saints are actually given the kingdom, right? So, now this is completely just additional data. I would not put any theological weight on this because it's kind of speculative, and it's more like parallelisms as opposed to concrete evidence for the idea that the investigative judgment is investigative, but it's there nonetheless. So, all right, with all the points considered about the nature of the judgment being investigative or not, the probability rises regarding the investigative nature of the judgment in Daniel 7. So, one idea in isolation is one thing, but when you put all these ideas together, it actually increases on the scale. So, in your opinion, where does it stand on the chart? This idea that the judgment is investigative or not, considering what we just looked at, the points we just looked at. I would not, just to be completely open and honest, I would not say that it's certainty or proof, but I would say that it's really high up there, beyond a reasonable doubt in terms of the evidence that we have, or maybe clear and convincing evidence. And remember that this is just data from Daniel 7. This is not taking into consideration what the Bible has to say about the judgment outside of Daniel 7, with the exception of a few verses we've looked at in the New Testament. Okay, so there's even more evidence that we could use here which would further strengthen this idea that there's an investigative element. Now, I want to just land on this last little idea here, which is to say that something is beyond a reasonable doubt means that there's no reasonable alternatives that remain. Okay. When I was talking with Ryan, one of the points that he was bringing out, and I guess maybe some other people think this too, he admits that there is a judgment of the saints. Trying to remember whether he thinks that's in Daniel 7 or not. But anyway, regardless, he does say that, yeah, everybody is looked at. Righteous and unrighteous are looked at in the judgment. The timing of it is different and all that kind of stuff according to him. But his view is that when there is a judgment of the saints spoken of, and that it is not a judgment that is looking at whether they're going to be saved or not in Daniel 7, but that the judgment is looking at the level of reward that they're going to get in heaven. We didn't really get off into what reward meant. I mean, maybe he's thinking about more stars in your crown or not. Well, he's probably not, because that idea comes from Ellen White, as far as I know, and he doesn't believe that she's inspired, as far as I've heard from him. But a level of reward. So, yeah, the saints are judged, but it's not about whether they're going to be saved or not. It's about what level of reward they're going to get. Okay. Is that what Daniel 7 says, though? Think about it. There's only 3 instances where it says that the kingdom is given to the saints, or the judgment is made in favor of the saints, right? 3 instances. And what are the outcomes of that? The outcomes are that the saints are given the kingdom. So if you're given the kingdom, what does that mean? It means you're saved. Because if you're not given the kingdom, it means you're not saved. Right? So Daniel 7 is most definitely, unequivocally speaking about a judgment that is looking at the salvation of the saints. Now, if you want to make the argument that there might be some other judgments or maybe some other elements of the same judgments that's described elsewhere in the Bible to try to prove the point that the judgment as it relates to the saints is only talking about the level of reward they're going to receive. Fine, you can make that point, and as it says here in the chart, maybe it's a reasonable alternative. But you cannot take that idea and impose that on Daniel 7 in a way that would negate what Daniel 7 is actually saying. You could maybe say that's an additional idea that you could put into Daniel 7. I don't know if you would call that eisegesis or not, versus exegesis. But even if you do add that in there, that idea from other verses outside of Daniel 7, you can't use that to negate the idea that the Daniel 7 judgment is looking at whether the saints are going to receive the kingdom or not. So do I think that that's a reasonable alternative that he's bringing up? No, I don't. Unless you want to loosen the standards of biblical interpretation and hermeneutics, and you want to say that, you can just take verses from different places and apply them however you want. And I don't think that Ryan would agree to that. And I don't think that, in fact, I know he wouldn't, because he and others make the claim that Adventists are using loose exegesis to make the claims that they are about things like, Daniel 8:14, and making incorrect connections between Daniel 8 and Leviticus, for example, in the sanctuary system. So, yeah, I'm sure that he would be opposed to that type of hermeneutics. So it's just interesting to me that it seems like that type of hermeneutics would be needed to be employed to say that the judgment in Daniel 7 would be anything other than looking at whether the righteous are saved or the saints are saved or not. So if I haven't confused you by now, you're doing really good. All right, let's wrap this up. Okay, so we have now looked at the investigative element of the judgment. We have looked at the chronology of the judgment, come to the conclusion that there's a judgment in Daniel 7 described as happening after the time times and half the time, in other words, after 1798. We've also looked at the nature of that judgment, that it is both a global judgment in scope and that it is a judgment that is looking at individuals that go all the way back to the time of Adam, and that it is a judgment that has an investigative element to it for sure. Well, not for sure. Got to remember our standards of proof. Nearly for sure. Final slide here. Final probability. Given the information that we've derived from Daniel 7, how likely is it that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has it correct when they say that there is a heavenly investigative judgment that began in 1844? Evidence so far has led in that direction. Only a study of Daniel 8 would give more precise and conclusive data. Okay, I hope you understood what I just wrote there in that slide. Basically, we're not looking at Daniel 8 in this one, in this study. And Daniel 8 is where you actually get the 1844 date from, with regards to the investigative judgment. But, I mean, we've filled in like 90% of the coloring page here, and it is all supported the idea of what the Adventist Church has said about the investigative judgment. And we've only looked at one chapter, which is Daniel 7. So could it be probable, likely, that the Adventist Church might also have it right when it comes to 1844 being the date and Daniel 8:14? Could it be? I mean, so far it sure seems like they've gotten it right. I mean, I think it would be more probable than to say that, yeah, maybe you're right so far, but then you got it wrong when it came to 1844. Right? And You can argue, you know, what you want, I suppose, but at a certain point, after you weigh the data, if you're handling things and the data honestly, I think you can look at the scales and say, yeah, it's the information and the data is headed in the direction of the Adventist Church's interpretation being correct regarding the investigative judgment. And yes, the investigative judgment does seem to be a biblical teaching. So we're going to end it there. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me via the email that I just put into, or that I had on that one slide. And I hope this has been helpful to somebody out there. Let me know if you have any questions. All right.